Robert Samuel Johnson came into the world in the small city of Lawton, Oklahoma, on a winter day in 1920. His father worked as an automobile mechanic, surrounded by engines, metal, and the smell of fuel. Machines were part of daily life in the Johnson home, and from an early age Robert understood what it meant for steel and oil to be pushed to their limits. In the summer of 1928 his father took him to nearby Fort Sill, where an Army Air Corps demonstration team called the Three Musketeers put on an air show at Post Field. Biplanes looped and climbed above the Oklahoma plain, weaving tight patterns against the open sky. Johnson later wrote that this was the moment he truly noticed military aviation. The planes were still small and made of fabric and wood, but in that afternoon he saw that a person could step into a cockpit and leave the ground behind. As he grew older, aviation remained more than a passing fascination. He built model aircraft and studied every airplane photograph and magazine he could find. While he was still a teenager, he earned a private pilot license and joined the civilian pilot training program while attending college, trading spare hours and limited money for time in trainers and on airfields. Flying was not yet a profession for him, but it was already becoming a central line in his life. When the global situation darkened at the end of the 1930s and into the early 1940s, Johnson was one of many young Americans who sensed that their country might soon be drawn into a wider war. In the summer of 1941 he enlisted as an aviation cadet in what would become the Army Air Forces of the United States, entering service at Oklahoma City in November. The attack on Pearl Harbor came only weeks later, turning training from a distant preparation into an urgent national priority almost overnight. Pre-flight training began at Kelly Field in Texas, with long days of classroom work mixed with physical conditioning, navigation, and the theory behind engines and aerodynamics. From there he moved on to primary flying instruction at a civilian school in Sikeston, Missouri. He first flew the PT-19 and then the PT-18, open cockpit trainers that demanded accuracy and calm reactions. The winter air was bitterly cold at altitude, and every landing, every stall and spin recovery added to a growing base of skill. Johnson completed nearly 60 hours of primary training and more than 175 landings before moving to successive stages of advanced training. The curriculum was designed to turn young men into reliable pilots as quickly as possible, but it was not gentle. Mistakes could be fatal, and training accidents were common across the system. Those who fell behind washed out and went back to ground duties. Those who remained progressed toward wings and a commission. Johnson stayed in the program, keeping his place through consistent if not spectacular performance. By July 1942 he was commissioned as a second lieutenant. At that time he was still classified as a bomber pilot, and his initial path did not point toward single-seat fighters. That changed when he received orders assigning him to the 56th Fighter Group, specifically the 61st Fighter Squadron, in the summer of 1942. The group was based at Bridgeport in Connecticut and had been selected to work with a new kind of fighter that was only just leaving the production line. The aircraft was the P-47 Thunderbolt, built by Republic Aviation. It was unlike the slender fighters that many people imagined when they thought of air combat. The Thunderbolt was huge for a single-engine plane, dominated by a wide radial engine at the nose and a rugged fuselage. It carried 8 heavy machine guns in its wings and had thick armor around the pilot and major systems. It could fly fast, dive at very high speeds, and absorb punishment that would destroy more fragile designs. At the same time it was heavy, demanding, and not easily tamed. When Johnson reached the group on the East Coast in July 1942, the 56th Fighter Group had just received early P-47B models straight from the factory. In practical terms, the unit was both a training organization and a test outfit. Pilots and ground crews were learning the aircraft at the same time, discovering its strengths and its dangerous limits in real flights rather than in neat diagrams. In this early period, the group experienced more than 40 crashes and 18 fatalities, a stark reminder that the machine they were learning to master was powerful enough to kill its own students even before it met enemy fire. Johnson later argued that the Thunderbolt's incredibly robust airframes saved many lives even in training. Engines failed, controls froze in high-speed dives, and small airfields sometimes proved marginal for such a large fighter, yet pilots walked away from wrecks that might have been fatal in thinner-skinned aircraft. The group's experience gave the Army Air Forces their first real understanding of compressibility in high-speed dives, a phenomenon that locked controls and sent early Thunderbolts plunging downward until pilots discovered the right way to recover. In late 1942, the 56th Fighter Group was alerted for movement overseas. Flying operations in the United States ceased in November, and at the end of December the men were sent to Camp Kilmer in New Jersey, one of the main staging areas for units bound for the European theater. On the 6th of January 1943, Johnson and his comrades sailed from New York aboard the liner Queen Elizabeth, converted into a fast troopship. Aircraft would follow separately. The crossing was crowded but swift, and within little more than a week they were in Scotland, then on to their first airfield in Britain at King's Cliffe. Once in England, the group was issued newer P-47C models and resumed intensive flying. The weather was different, the airfields were different, and the reality of a war zone hung over everything. Johnson faced an additional complication. On paper he was still a bomber pilot, and that classification meant he was not yet authorized to fly the Thunderbolt in combat. In March he was sent to a gunnery school at Llanbedr in Wales for a 2-week course that was meant to qualify him. He would finally fire the 8 wing guns in a controlled environment, proving that he could put rounds on target. Instead, bad weather closed in, flight after flight was cancelled, and he returned to King's Cliffe without ever firing in that training course. He knew that his commanders, including the group leader Colonel Hubert Zemke and his own flight leader Gerald Johnson, were watching closely. They needed fighter pilots who could not only fly, but also shoot accurately under pressure, stay with their formations, and think clearly while escorting bombers over enemy territory. Each delay, each missed qualification, chipped away at Johnson's confidence. Around him other pilots were moving steadily toward combat status. The Thunderbolts lined up on the field were no longer just new machines waiting to be tested. They were becoming the shield for heavy bomber streams that would soon cross the North Sea and the Channel toward occupied Europe. By April 1943, the 56th Fighter Group was declared operational. The unit moved from King's Cliffe to another base at Horsham St. Faith, closer to the bomber routes. The first missions were scheduled, briefings were held, and air crews began to trace on maps the lines that would soon carry them over coasts, rivers, and flak belts. On the 18th of April, Johnson finally flew his first combat sortie, a fighter sweep over the coast of the Netherlands. It passed without contact, a quiet entry into a violent arena. Yet even that uneventful flight marked a dividing line. From that day forward, every time he strapped into a Thunderbolt in England, he was stepping into a machine that might have to bring him home through fire. He had grown from a boy staring up at biplanes over Fort Sill into a lieutenant of the 61st Fighter Squadron, flying one of the heaviest single-engine fighters of the war. Training accidents, bureaucratic classifications, bad weather and hard landings had all been navigated. What lay ahead was something different. The enemy now was not a stalled engine or a short runway, but experienced fighter pilots of the Luftwaffe, flying sleek Focke-Wulf fighters and Messerschmitts over their own territory. Before long, the rugged Thunderbolt that had already claimed lives in training would be tested under a harsher standard, far above the fields and towns of occupied France, where steel, fuel, and human endurance would be strained at the edge of destruction. In the spring of 1943, the 56th Fighter Group left the phase of preparation and stepped into active war. At Horsham St. Faith in Norfolk, Thunderbolts sat in long rows on pierced steel planking, their cowlings open while ground crews checked the big radial engines. The weather was often gray and low, with cloud layers over the flat fields of eastern England. Briefing rooms filled with maps, recognition charts, and target photos replaced the classrooms of the training bases back in the United States. On 18 April 1943, Second Lieutenant Robert Johnson flew his first combat mission. It was only the second mission for the 56th Fighter Group. The task was a fighter sweep over the coast of the Netherlands, intended to probe enemy reactions and gain experience. The sortie passed without contact. No German fighters appeared, and no bombers were present to be guarded. The formation climbed, cruised over the sea and the low coastline, then returned to Horsham St. Faith. It was a quiet introduction, but it placed Johnson on the roster as a combat pilot in the European theater. Soon afterward, his progress toward full qualification hit an unexpected barrier. Johnson and several others were sent north to a Royal Air Force station at Goxhill for gunnery training. There they were supposed to fire at a fabric sleeve towed behind another aircraft, demonstrating that they could score a minimum percentage of hits. In this controlled environment, he struggled with deflection shooting, and day after day his score stayed below the required threshold. Only on the final day did his rounds begin to find the target, but by then the record of previous flights meant that he failed to meet the official standard. On paper, he returned to his squadron without the gunnery qualification that the system expected from a fighter pilot. While he was away, the war had already announced its cost to the group. On 29 April, during one of the early bomber support operations, the 56th flew into combat for the first time and lost 2 pilots and 2 Thunderbolts. Johnson was not on that mission. When he resumed operations in early May, he did so in a unit that had already seen men fail to return and knew that the Luftwaffe would not give them a gentle apprenticeship. On 14 May 1943, Johnson met German fighters in the air for the first time. The mission was to escort heavy bombers, flying fortress types, attacking the port city of Antwerp. Over occupied territory, the formation encountered Focke-Wulf fighters moving in to break up the escort. In the confused movements of that engagement, Johnson damaged 2 Focke-Wulf 190 fighters that had broken his own squadron's formation. He became separated from the group and, with fuel and altitude to consider, turned back alone toward England. When he landed, he discovered that he had already been reported as missing in action, a reminder of how quickly a pilot could vanish in the confusion of combat. 5 days later, on 19 May, he flew as part of a diversionary mission meant to draw German fighters away from main bomber streams. This time his flight was ambushed. German fighters dived from above, using the advantage of altitude that experienced Luftwaffe units had learned to exploit. Johnson, still relatively inexperienced, once again survived the encounter without scoring a confirmed kill, evading the enemy and bringing his Thunderbolt home. The pattern was clear. The Luftwaffe units they faced combined local knowledge, tactical discipline, and a sharp sense for vulnerable formations, and the pilots of the 56th were still learning. Through these early missions, Colonel Hubert Zemke, the group commander, was shaping both tactics and attitude. He was not impressed at first by the rate of climb and acceleration of the Thunderbolt, but he recognized its strengths in a dive and its ability to roll and absorb damage. Instead of allowing discontent to grow, he emphasized those strengths. He pressed for strict formation discipline, drilled his pilots to use altitude as a reserve of energy and speed, and began to experiment with methods that would later evolve into broad, fan-shaped patrol patterns ahead of bomber streams. Under his direction, the 56th changed from a collection of pilots adapting to a new aircraft into a coherent fighting unit with its own doctrine. Within that structure, Johnson was still seen as one of the less polished pilots. His difficulties at Goxhill were known, and he did not yet have a confirmed victory. Even so, he continued to fly escort and sweep missions, gaining experience among men like Francis Gabreski and David Schilling, who would themselves become leading aces of the group. On 13 June 1943, flying in a flight led by his squadron commander Gabreski, Johnson finally had a clear chance. That day, the 56th met Focke-Wulf fighters of a German unit over occupied territory. When Johnson spotted an enemy aircraft, he immediately turned to attack, following the principle that the pilot who first saw the enemy should engage without hesitation, supported by his wingman. He closed and fired on a Focke-Wulf 190, sending it down and claiming his first confirmed kill. When the mission debrief was held, however, another pilot denied having agreed to the prearranged plan, and Johnson was formally reprimanded by Zemke and senior officers for breaking formation. The victory stood, but the criticism marked him as a pilot who had to balance aggressiveness against group discipline more carefully. By late June 1943, the 56 Fighter Group had progressed from its uncertain early sorties to a point where many of its pilots had tasted combat. They had learned that the Thunderbolt could dive faster than German fighters and withstand high-speed stresses that had once been barely understood. They had also seen that in close turning fights the German aircraft were dangerous opponents, and that poor radio performance and scattered formations could quickly turn an escort mission into a series of isolated duels. Above occupied Europe, the balance between experience and inexperience, between tactical cohesion and sudden fragmentation, was still delicate. In the last week of June, orders came for a new mission. Thunderbolts from the 56th would operate from a forward base at Manston in Kent, closer to the Channel. They were to provide cover for returning heavy bombers that had struck at an airfield near Paris, a task that on paper matched previous escort duties. The move to the forward strip brought the pilots physically nearer to enemy territory and compressed their reaction times. Operations staff charted rendezvous points over northern France, while armorers loaded ammunition into the wings of the big fighters and ground crews checked fuel and oil. For Robert Johnson, who by then had one confirmed kill and several hard-fought escapes behind him, the mission ahead appeared as another step in a series of hazardous but familiar operations. Yet the route drawn on maps from Manston to the rendezvous near the French town of Forges-les-Eaux would place his Thunderbolt in a position that combined all the strengths and weaknesses of pilot, aircraft, and tactics, under the eyesights of some of the most experienced German fighter pilots still operating in the West. On 26 June 1943, the 56th Fighter Group operated from the forward airfield at Manston in Kent. The base lay close to the English Channel, a strip of concrete and steel matting with only a short distance between dispersal points and the cliff edge. That afternoon, 48 P-47 fighters from the group were assigned to cover heavy bombers returning from a raid on Villacoublay airfield near Paris. The plan was straightforward. The Thunderbolts would climb from Manston, cross the Channel, and meet the bomber stream near the French town of Forges-les-Eaux as it made its way back toward the sea. The aircraft were P-47C models, earlier versions of the Thunderbolt that still carried the same combination of a large radial engine, heavy armament, and thick armor. Johnson flew with the 61st Fighter Squadron, his machine marked with the squadron code and known by the nickname Half Pint. The mission briefing had emphasized formation discipline and fuel management. Their role was to deter and disrupt any German fighters seeking to cut into the bomber formation as it returned from its target. The expectation was that if an engagement came, it would center on protecting the larger aircraft, as it had on earlier days. Late in the afternoon, the Thunderbolts took off from Manston in quick succession, climbing out over the Channel and settling into their assigned positions. The airspace between England and France was familiar now, marked by fixed navigation points and habitual routes, but it never became routine. Across the water they obtained altitude, forming up in 3 squadrons, each group climbing to a height calculated to allow them to meet the bombers with both energy and fuel reserves intact. As they approached the rendezvous area near Forges-les-Eaux, Johnson flew near the rear of the 61st Squadron's formation, scanning the sky as instructed, watching both above and behind. The German response came from a direction that exploited the weak point of any formation. 16 Focke-Wulf 190 fighters from a unit of Jagdgeschwader 26 approached from above and behind the Thunderbolts. They waited until the American formation was close to its rendezvous point, then dived in a coordinated attack. The first pass was sudden and violent. Cannon shells and machine gun fire tore through the rear elements of the P-47 formation. In that initial strike, several Thunderbolts were hit and the carefully built structure of the group began to break apart as pilots instinctively broke to avoid fire and attackers. Johnson, flying in the vulnerable rear position, became the target of one Focke-Wulf that pressed its attack hard. In a concentrated firing run, the German pilot poured both 20mm cannon and rifle-caliber machine gun fire into the fuselage and wings of Johnson's Thunderbolt. Later examination counted around 21 cannon shell impacts in the fuselage alone, along with a large number of smaller caliber hits. The hydraulic system, which controlled flaps, landing gear and other mechanisms, was ruptured. The canopy was shattered and fragments of perspex and metal entered the cockpit. A piece of shrapnel lodged in his leg and a grazing bullet wound marked the tip of his nose. The engine was damaged and oil began to leak along the fuselage. Inside the cockpit, the immediate effect was loss of visibility and control. Oil and fuel sprayed, flames appeared around the engine, and the aircraft nose dropped sharply. The Thunderbolt rolled and entered a spin, falling away from the level of the formation. With hydraulic fluid draining away and parts of the canopy jammed, the machine no longer responded in the normal way. Johnson's P-47 fell in spirals, the heavy airframe now acting under the combined pressure of gravity, asymmetrical damage and disrupted airflow rather than clean control inputs. The Thunderbolt's structural strength, which had been demonstrated many times in training accidents, now became a deciding factor. The airframe held together under the stress of high-speed descent and partial fire. As the aircraft fell, the flames that had licked around the engine began to subside, starved of fuel or extinguished by the airflow. With effort on the remaining controls and by applying rudder, Johnson was able to break the spin, level the wings, and bring the nose back up. The P-47 that had seemed on the verge of breaking apart steadied, still badly damaged, but once again a controllable aircraft rather than an uncontrolled projectile. When the spin ended, he found himself alone in the sky, separated from both his own squadron and the bomber formation. Below lay occupied France. Behind him, somewhere above, were still German fighters from a unit that had already proved willing and able to press home attacks against damaged opponents. The Thunderbolt's hydraulic system was gone, the canopy remained partly jammed, instruments were smeared, and the aircraft was leaking fluids from multiple points. Ahead lay the line of the Channel, still at a distance that demanded both engine reliability and freedom from further interference. As Johnson nursed the damaged P-47, testing what control surfaces still responded and what power settings the engine would tolerate, the fight around the shattered formation of Thunderbolts continued in scattered fragments of combat. The Focke-Wulf 190 that had struck him so heavily did not remain his only concern. As he began to aim his crippled fighter roughly toward the route that would take him back to the coast, another German aircraft noticed the lone, wounded Thunderbolt below and turned in, beginning a new approach on a target that clearly bore the marks of heavy damage yet refused to fall. The lone German fighter came in low from behind, its pilot having picked out the wounded P-47 as it staggered away from the broken engagement. Robert Johnson saw it only as a shape growing larger in the mirror, and then as a flash of wings and nose passing through the center of his oil-streaked windscreen. The first attack had stripped his Thunderbolt of much of its protection. Now another opponent was moving in to finish the work. The Focke-Wulf 190 slid into position behind the damaged American fighter. Its pilot had already spent his heavy cannon ammunition in the first phase of the battle, but the two rifle-caliber machine guns in the nose were still loaded. The German opened fire and a fresh stream of rounds hammered into the tail and fuselage of the Thunderbolt. Tracers reached forward along the spine of the aircraft, chewing at metal already torn and bent. The sound inside the cockpit changed from the roar of the engine and the rush of air to a constant hard drumming that seemed to come from every direction at once. Johnson had already tried to escape his crippled machine. When the Thunderbolt had first fallen into a spin and fire had licked into the cockpit, he had attempted to slide back the canopy and bail out. The frame moved only a few inches and jammed. He had tried to force himself out through the shattered perspex, but his parachute harness caught and held. With the aircraft still plunging downward, there had been no time to fight both the spin and the stuck canopy. He had been forced back into the seat, strapped in place with a parachute that now kept him inside the very machine he had tried to leave. Hydraulic fluid and oil had sprayed into the cockpit during the earlier damage. The liquid burned his eyes and face, leaving his vision blurred and his skin stinging. Smoke had filled the cramped space until the flames died. Instruments were cracked or useless, and the windscreen in front of him was smeared almost opaque. To see ahead, he had to lean sideways and raise his head into the broken opening in the canopy, letting the slipstream tear at his helmet and goggles while he tried to keep some sense of direction. Now, as the German fighter raked his Thunderbolt again and again with machine gun fire, Johnson tried to make his aircraft as difficult a target as the limited controls would allow. The loss of hydraulic pressure meant that every movement of the control surfaces came from the direct force of his hands and feet, working against damaged linkages and bent metal. He pushed and kicked, swinging the tail from side to side, letting the Thunderbolt yaw and wallow so that the German pilot had to adjust his aim constantly. The Focke-Wulf pulled up slightly, circled, and came back in for another pass. The pattern repeated. The Germans settled in behind the American fighter, opened fire, and sent a renewed line of bullets into the already shredded structure. More holes appeared in the wings. The skin of the tail peeled in places. Fragments of metal flew past the cockpit. Inside, Johnson felt impacts thudding through the seat and cockpit floor, some close enough to cut fabric and scrape metal near his legs. The controls remained just responsive enough to keep the machine from rolling over and entering another spin. At some point during these repeated attacks, the German pilot pulled up alongside instead of straight behind. For a moment the two aircraft flew almost level, only a few lengths apart. Johnson could see the yellow marking on the nose of the Focke-Wulf, the outline of the cockpit, the helmeted figure inside. Accounts gathered later described the German looking over the length of the Thunderbolt, visually checking the torn metal, the splintered canopy, the leaking lines of fluid, and the fact that the American pilot was still in the seat and the aircraft still in the air. In some versions of the story, Johnson believed in that instant that the German had decided to let him go. He had already endured several firing passes. The amount of visible damage suggested that no more was required to secure a kill. The two aircraft, enemies in a sky that had been full of smoke and tracer only minutes before, ran side by side for a few moments, separated by only a few arm lengths and the open space of the afternoon air over northern France. The respite did not last. The Focke-Wulf rolled away, circled behind the Thunderbolt again and resumed firing with its remaining machine gun ammunition. The bursts came shorter now, the intervals between them a little longer. Johnson kept working the rudder and stick, letting the nose wander, refusing to present a stable target even though every movement cost him effort and brought new jolts of pain from his leg and nose. The German persisted, making pass after pass at an opponent that refused either to fall or to surrender. On the final runs the fire slackened. The machine gun tracers thinned and then stopped entirely. The German fighter moved up once more to the side of the Thunderbolt. This time, accounts agree that the pilot of the Focke-Wulf rocked his wings in a clear, deliberate motion. It was a standard signal between pilots, a kind of acknowledgement. Faced with an aircraft that would not die and a pilot who continued to fight a barely controllable machine back toward friendly territory, the Germans seemed to accept that no more could be done without weapons. With that last roll of the wings, the Focke-Wulf turned away and headed back toward its own side of the lines. The sky around Johnson was suddenly empty. Far off, the main fight had moved away or burned itself out. Above and ahead lay only cloud and the distant line of the Channel. Behind him, the threat of another attack had finally gone. The condition of the Thunderbolt remained desperate. Johnson's leg bled where shrapnel had lodged. His nose throbbed from the grazing bullet wound. He was half blind from the stinging hydraulic fluid and smoke. The cockpit was littered with glass splinters and fragments of metal. The canopy was still jammed, the frame bent and immovable. The hydraulic system was gone, and the undercarriage and flaps that depended upon it would not operate in the normal way. The engine, scarred by cannon shells and bullet strikes, still ran, but at a power level that could not be pushed much higher without risk. He trimmed the aircraft as best he could and aimed its damaged nose toward the northwest, in the general direction of the English coast. Without full instruments he had to rely on what remained of his sense of heading and height. The Thunderbolt settled into a slow, shallow descent, its lift reduced by the torn metal of the wings and the disturbed airflow around the battered fuselage. He knew that if the descent was too steep he would reach the ground or the water before he reached friendly territory. If he tried to climb or turn too hard the engine might fail or the already weakened structure might give way. The distance between his current position over occupied France and the friendly airfields of southern England was not great on a map. In a damaged fighter that had endured 21 cannon shell strikes and more than 200 smaller caliber hits, it seemed far longer. Every minute of flight would depend on the endurance of a machine that had already exceeded normal expectations. The rugged construction that designers at Republic Aviation had built into the Thunderbolt, with its heavy spars and thick skin, had allowed it to survive an ordeal that would have destroyed many other fighters in the first few seconds. Now that same strength had to carry it over open water. Below, the landscape of northern France slid slowly past, fields and roads and scattered villages glimpsed through gaps in the clouds and in the oil streaks on what remained of the windscreen. Above, the sky gradually cleared of the last faint trails of the earlier battle. Johnson kept his attention fixed on the line where land would end and sea would begin. The English Channel had always been a barrier and a refuge for pilots in this theater, A strip of water that could mean either rescue by air-sea units or the loss of a pilot and aircraft in cold waves. As the coastline finally appeared ahead, faint and gray through the haze and the damaged glass, he faced a final set of problems. Crossing the channel meant dealing with the possibility of engine failure over water. Reaching the English side meant confronting the question of how to land a fighter whose landing gear and flaps no longer responded and whose pilot could barely see straight ahead. For the moment, there was no option but to continue. The Thunderbolt's nose edged out over the shoreline and the water beyond, beginning the last leg of a journey that had started over a small town in France and had already passed through fire, spiraling descent, and relentless pursuit. The damaged Thunderbolt edged out over the northern coast of France and left the land behind. Beneath Robert Johnson, the shoreline dropped away into the gray-green waters of the English Channel. The aircraft shuddered faintly as it met the colder air above the sea. Every vibration felt like a warning. Oil still streaked along the fuselage. Hydraulic fluid had long since drained away. The engine, punctured and battered, continued to turn, but its tone was uneven, a rough growl instead of the cleaner note he had known on training flights. Inside the cockpit, the air was sharp and cold. With the windscreen smeared by oil and the canopy jammed, Johnson had to lean into the broken opening above his head to see ahead. The slipstream tore at his goggles and helmet. His leg throbbed where shrapnel remained embedded. The tip of his nose stung and pulsed with every heartbeat. The stinging residue of hydraulic fluid burned his eyes. He squinted against the wind, trying to keep the faint outline of the distant English coast fixed in his sight. The Thunderbolt flew in a shallow descent. With the wings torn and the fuselage holed in dozens of places, the aircraft could not be trimmed into a clean cruise. Any attempt to climb risked a stall on one damaged wing or further strain on the already weakened structure. Johnson held just enough power to keep the machine above the water, allowing the slow loss of height that he hoped would intersect with solid ground rather than cold waves. He checked what instruments still worked. Some dials were cracked and motionless. Others flickered with hesitant life, giving partial readings through smeared glass. Below, the channel seemed close and distant at the same time. From this height, the whitecaps were only shifting patterns on a gray surface. For many pilots in this theater, the water had been the final barrier, a place where damaged aircraft fell short of the coast and where air-sea rescue craft searched for survivors. Johnson knew that bailing out now, with the canopy frame bent and jammed, was almost impossible. The harness that had trapped him earlier would likely do so again. Even if he managed to escape, the odds of being found in time in the cold water were not favorable. The only real hope was to keep the Thunderbolt flying until it reached England. Minute by minute, the damaged fighter closed the distance. The German pilot who had made the last respectful wing rock had turned back toward occupied territory. No further enemy aircraft appeared. The sky around Johnson remained empty, an open space in which the single Thunderbolt crawled across the boundary between two nations and two fronts, leaving behind the battle above forges Les Eaux and heading for the radar stations and coastal batteries of Kent. Gradually, pale shapes appeared ahead through the haze. The eastern coast of England rose out of the mist, low cliffs and fields merging into a continuous line. The sight brought no relief, only a new series of calculations. The aircraft was over friendly water now, but its condition had not improved. The engine could fail at any moment. The hydraulic system was still dead, which meant that flaps and landing gear would not extend in the usual way. Visibility through the damaged canopy remained poor. Reaching land meant that he would soon have to decide how and where to attempt a landing in a fighter that did not want to be landed. As the shoreline drew closer, British coastal defenses and air bases below began to take notice. Controllers tracking movements over the channel saw the slow, solitary Thunderbolt approaching. From the ground, the aircraft's condition was not immediately obvious, only a single Allied fighter returning from the direction of France. As it came in lower, men on the airfields could make out the streaks of oil along the fuselage and the ragged edges of metal on the wings. Johnson aimed the Thunderbolt toward Manston, the same forward airfield from which he had taken off earlier that day. The strip lay only a short distance inland from the cliff edge, a broad expanse of runway and steel matting chosen precisely because damaged aircraft often sought it as a first refuge when returning from combat over the channel. He circled very gently to line up with the main runway, careful not to ask more of the wings and tail than they could safely provide. The absence of hydraulic pressure soon made itself felt again. When he tried the usual controls for lowering the landing gear, nothing happened. The indicators remained in the up position. The emergency hand pump located in the cockpit offered only a faint resistance and no result. The mechanism for the wheels had been damaged together with the rest of the hydraulic system when the German cannon shells tore through the fuselage. There would be no conventional landing. The Thunderbolt would have to be put down on its belly. A wheels-up landing in a fighter was always a dangerous maneuver, even under controlled conditions. With a wounded pilot, limited visibility, and an airframe already weakened by multiple hits, the risk increased sharply. Yet there was no alternative. Johnson lowered the nose slightly, set what flaps he could, and kept the engine at a setting that would carry him to the threshold of the runway without forcing a steep descent. Ground crews and control personnel at Manston watched as the battered fighter came in, lower and lower, its undercarriage still retracted. On the final approach he cut power further and tried to hold the aircraft just above the runway, letting airspeed bleed away. Without full flaps, the Thunderbolt wanted to settle faster than usual. The damaged wings provided uneven lift. At the last moment the heavy fighter sank onto the surface. The belly of the fuselage struck the steel matting in a loud grinding impact that echoed across the airfield. Sparks flew along the underside as metal scraped against metal. The propeller blade struck and bent. The aircraft slewed slightly to one side but did not flip. Inside the cockpit the jolt snapped Johnson forward against his harness. Pain flared along his injured leg. Glass fragments rattled in the frame. The Thunderbolt slid along the runway for a considerable distance, shedding speed as it went, until friction and momentum equalized and the machine came to a halt in a haze of dust, smoke, and settling debris. For a moment there was only the ticking of the cooling engine and the distant sound of vehicles moving on the airfield. Fire crews and ambulances raced toward the wrecked fighter. Ground personnel clambered up onto the wings, peered into the cockpit, and began to pry at the jammed canopy. The same bent frame that had trapped Johnson when he tried to bail out now resisted the efforts of the men trying to reach him. Tools were brought up and the damaged perspex and metal were forced aside until an opening was made wide enough. When they finally pulled him free, he was covered in oil, hydraulic fluid, and blood, his face streaked and his flight gear torn. Shrapnel remained in his leg. The grazing wound on his nose was plainly visible. Yet he was conscious and alive. As medical orderlies took him to be treated, other men turned their attention to the Thunderbolt itself. What they saw along the fuselage and wings would become part of the story that spread among fighter units and later found its way into official histories and memoirs. The aircraft's skin was pitted with hundreds of holes. Inspection teams counted approximately 21 strikes from cannon shells in the fuselage, each one a hit that could have torn open a vital structure. In addition, there were more than 200 impacts from smaller caliber machine gun bullets. Sections of the tail had been flayed open. Control cables had been nicked and frayed without quite severing. The main structural members, however, remained intact. The heavy spars and frames that Republic engineers had designed into the Thunderbolt had absorbed and redistributed the forces instead of snapping. Mechanics traced one of the cannon hits to the region of the turbo supercharger, a key component in the Thunderbolt's power system. The shell had punched in and lodged without detonating in a way that would have blown the unit apart. Other shells had passed close to fuel tanks and the cockpit but had either failed to explode properly or had fragmented in directions that spared the pilot. The combination of rugged design and the unpredictable geometry of battle damage had allowed an aircraft that should have been destroyed in the sky over France to reach an English runway on its underside. News of the landing and the state of the aircraft moved quickly through the group and beyond. 4 pilots who had doubted the Thunderbolt's value, especially in its early days when training accidents had claimed lives, the sight of Johnson's fighter was a powerful argument. Here was a machine that had endured a concentrated attack by an experienced German pilot with both cannon and machine guns, had fallen into a spin, had recovered, had sustained multiple further attacks, and had still flown across the channel to a survivable landing. The aircraft might be heavy and less agile than its opponents in a tight turn, but its capacity to absorb punishment and keep flying was now beyond dispute. As Johnson lay in a hospital bed, doctors removing shrapnel and treating his injuries, discussions among commanders and pilots turned increasingly to what this episode meant for their tactics and for their confidence in the Thunderbolt. The machine that had carried him back from Forges Les Eaux had proven something about construction and survivability that statistics alone could not fully convey. In the weeks that followed, that evidence would begin to influence how pilots approached combat, how long they stayed with damaged aircraft, and how they viewed the balance between risk and resilience in the skies over occupied Europe. In the days after the landing at Manston, the wreck of Robert Johnson's Thunderbolt became an unusual kind of exhibit. The aircraft was towed from the runway and set down where maintenance crews and visiting officers could study it. Men walked slowly along the fuselage, tracing fingers around the ragged edges of holes left by cannon shells and machine gun bullets. They crouched under the tailplane to look at peeled metal and frayed control cables, then climbed onto the wings to peer into the shattered cockpit where oil and hydraulic fluid still stained every surface. The investigation was more than curiosity. It was a practical study of survival. Armorers counted and measured, logging every visible impact. They noted the way cannon shells had punched through the outer skin, sometimes detonating, sometimes passing through before exploding or failing to explode at all. They marked where smaller caliber bullets had struck ribs and frames, where some rounds had stopped in armor plate and others had ricocheted into non-vital spaces. The tally underlined what the first glance had suggested. The Thunderbolt had been struck in dozens upon dozens of places, and yet its core structure had held. Attention focused on the main spars in the wings, the thick beams that carried the loads of flight. Shells had come close, opening cavities around them, but the spars themselves had not broken. Armor plate behind the engine and around the cockpit showed dents and gouges where rounds had been slowed or stopped. Hydraulic lines had been sliced open, spilling their contents, yet redundant paths for mechanical control had allowed Johnson to keep moving the surfaces that mattered. The heavy radial engine at the nose had absorbed some of the earliest impacts, losing smoothness and power but continuing to turn. The design philosophy that had led Republic engineers to favor strength and mass over the last measure of agility was written in these scars. Photographs were taken of the wreck, showing the torn skin, the jagged canopy frame, and the long smear of damage running along the fuselage. These images circulated beyond the 56th Fighter Group. In briefing huts and ready rooms, pilots studied them and compared them to their own aircraft waiting outside on the dispersal pads. The story of the flight from Forges Les Eaux, from the first hail of cannon shells to the wheels-up landing on the steel matting at Manston, was retold in mess halls and at operations meetings. Each retelling reinforced the same conclusion. The Thunderbolt, whatever its shortcomings in a tight-turning fight, could take damage on a scale that few had imagined and still bring its pilot home. While this examination of metal and structure went on, Johnson began his own slower recovery. Medical staff removed shrapnel from his leg and treated the grazing wound on his nose. The exposure to hydraulic fluid and smoke had left his eyes painfully irritated. Rest and treatment gradually eased the burning and blurring. For a time he was kept away from flying duties while his body repaired itself from the strain of the mission. From a hospital bed or a rest billet he heard how his Thunderbolt had looked on the runway, how others had reacted when they saw it, how the counts of shell strikes and bullet impacts mounted with each new inspection. News of the combat itself spread not only within Allied ranks but also through intelligence channels that monitored German communications and reports. At the time, many in the 56th Group believed that the experienced German pilot who had attacked Johnson so relentlessly was the ace Egon Mayer, a leading figure in the defense of occupied Europe. Mayer had a history of successful engagements against Allied bombers and fighters, and his unit operated in the regions where the combat had taken place. The assumption that he had been the hunter over Forges Les Eaux added an extra layer of drama to the story and found its way into early versions of the account. Later research would show that this identification was almost certainly incorrect, that the timings and locations of Mayer's recorded flights did not match the details of the engagement that day. The German pilot who had emptied his ammunition into Johnson's Thunderbolt, circled repeatedly, and finally rocked his wings in acknowledgement remained unnamed. Yet in the immediate aftermath, the name of Egon Mayer became attached to the story, another element that gave the episode weight in the eyes of fellow pilots. If a leading German ace had been unable to shoot down the heavily damaged Thunderbolt, what did that say about the aircraft's ability to withstand lesser attacks? For commanders, the incident offered more than a dramatic tale. Colonel Hubert Zemke and his officers saw in it a confirmation of the tactics they were developing. They had already begun to emphasize diving attacks, energy fighting, and the value of altitude over pure turning ability. Now they had public proof that, in addition to these fighting strengths, their chosen aircraft also had a defensive strength that could not be ignored. Pilots could afford to press their attacks a little harder, to stay with crippled bombers a little longer, knowing that their fighters were not as fragile as some had feared. At the same time, the episode highlighted the dangers of certain situations. The manner of the initial ambush over Forges Les Eaux, with German fighters diving out of the sun onto the rear of a formation, underlined the importance of high cover and constant vigilance. Zemke used the reports to refine his instructions on scanning sectors of the sky, on staggering the heights of escort elements, and on keeping a reserve of fighters above the main group to respond to surprise attacks from higher altitude. The fact that Johnson had been flying in a vulnerable rear position at the moment of impact became a concrete example in future briefings. Within weeks, Johnson was back with his unit. The injuries he had suffered were not disabling, and the demand for experienced pilots in the European theater remained high. The memory of the flight and of the repeated German attacks stayed with him, but his return to duty was not treated as an exception. Other pilots had been wounded and had gone back to flying. The war in the air over Europe was still in its middle stages, and every man who could climb into a cockpit and operate effectively was needed. When he returned to combat operations, he did so in a squadron whose view of the Thunderbolt had shifted. The sight of his wrecked aircraft had encouraged a new level of trust in the machine. Pilots spoke of it less as a heavy and unforgiving brute and more as a tough partner that could endure punishment alongside them. This trust did not erase the need for skill, nor did it guarantee survival, but it changed the way men felt when they strapped in and tightened their harnesses before takeoff. The legend of that flight continued to grow. Reports reached the United States. Articles and briefings used it to illustrate the ruggedness of the Thunderbolt and the determination of its pilots. Johnson's name became known beyond his immediate circle. Yet behind the growing reputation lay the simple facts established by the investigations at Manston and the medical notes from his recovery. A single pilot had remained trapped in a damaged aircraft that should by most measures have fallen from the sky. A single aircraft had endured an extraordinary concentration of fire and had still managed to cross sea and land to a runway. For the 56th Fighter Group, this was not an isolated story but part of a broader pattern that was beginning to emerge. Their early losses and hard lessons were being converted into new tactics and a more confident understanding of their aircraft's capabilities. German units that had once enjoyed clear advantages in experience and familiarity with local conditions were now meeting opponents who were better trained, better organized, and prepared to fight with a combination of aggression and calculated risk. The battle above Forges Les Eaux and the wrecked Thunderbolt at Manston were markers along that path, points where the balance began to tilt more clearly toward the side that had once been struggling to adapt. As summer deepened over England and over the occupied coasts across the Channel, Thunderbolts of the 56th Group continued to climb into gray skies, escorting bombers and hunting for enemy fighters. The story of Johnson's return from France traveled with them, a reminder that the machines they flew were more resilient than they sometimes appeared, and that in the chaotic exchanges of fire and maneuver above Europe, survival could come from a combination of design, training, and a refusal to give up control of a damaged aircraft until every other possibility had been exhausted.